Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar, Communication Skills for the Modern Organisation. We're going to be looking at organisation communication skills for councils and housing associations. My name's Carl Lamb and I'm going to be your host today. And before I pass you to our presenter, I just need to run through some housekeeping with you. Okay, so on the right hand side of your screen, you should have a chat panel, which is available for you to ask any questions. You can ask questions at any time during the presentation and we'll answer most of those at the end. The sound, everybody's on mute today. If anybody does have any desire to speak, then feel free to do so. If you just ask us in the chat panel and we'll unmute you. There's no webcams, fortunately. The webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you. We'll send that via email to you this week, along with the slide deck. There's a couple of polls during the webinar. Please take the time to engage with these polls as it will determine what we're going to be talking about during the webinar itself. Again, there's 3 questions at the end of the webinar. If you could just take the time just to give us some feedback on the webinar and its usefulness, that would be fantastic. And lastly, there's no workbooks, but the presentation slide deck is available within the control panel to download if you wish to do so. Okay, so I have great pleasure in introducing our guest speaker today, which is Barry Wall. Barry is a seasoned business skills professional trainer. He delivers training for Escala in the north of England primarily, and he delivers numerous courses and coaching, etc., etc. Do you want to say hello, Barry?
Hello all.
Hello.
I'm here.
We've also got Paul Routh with us, who'll be on the Q&A fielding any questions at the end. Hello, Paul.
Hi, Carl. Hello, everybody.
Okay, so just moving on, here are some resources and courses that we deliver as an organisation, which are relevant to the content of this webinar. So there's 3 courses there, the links to the course outlines, and also a case study that we did with Ada and Worthing councils, which may be of interest to you. Before we begin the webinar properly, there's just a couple of poll questions that I want to ask. As I say, if you can just take the time just to answer these, that would be fantastic. So the first one's going to appear on your screen in 1 moment. So hopefully the question should be there. Have you noticed an increase in the number of difficult and challenging conversations? So maybe it's due to welfare reforms or budget cuts or something else, service demand, and that's driving up challenging customer conversations. I'll just give you another 5 seconds and I'll close that poll. Just some responses still coming through. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. And I'm just going to share those results with you. There we go. So you can see the results on screen. So I think most people there have said a steady increase. Is that what you expected to see, Barry?
Yes, that's what my experience tells me from what I've been doing previously, that is certainly what we've seen. It's been rather than something that's just gone bang, it's been a very steady increase over quite a sustained period of time. So we'll have some discussion around that, definitely.
Brilliant. Okay. And I'm just going to ask the second poll question now, and this will help us determine what Barry is going to talk about today. So that's just coming on screen now, hopefully. Yeah, so which of the following areas are causing you and your teams the most challenges? If anybody does tick other to this, then please just let us know what that other is in the questions panel. That'd be fantastic. Okay, we're still getting responses in for this poll. I'll just give 5 more seconds for that. Okay, I think I'm going to close it there, and I'm going to share those results with you. Okay, so 33%, so nearly a third, said that dealing with vulnerable clients is one of the top issues. Second to that by a few percent is dealing with angry and distressed clients. And after that, very close as well, dealing with negotiation around debt recovery skills. So yeah, it seems to be the top three, Barry. Is that what you expected to see there?
It's certainly what I expect to see. The idea of the vulnerable has become all prescient and is ever there. So I think that's a terribly interesting topic for us to kick off with, really.
Brilliant.
Just to use that as a topic to kick off with.
Okay, so I'm just going to hide those polls. There we go. And I'll just make you the presenter, and then we can start. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Carl. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending. First off, let's get my screen up so you can see what's going on. There we are. Vulnerability, defining vulnerability. It's interesting, the polls that you've answered there have told me essentially what I knew from the previous work that we've been doing over the last few years with councils and with housing associations in regard to communication in general, debt collection, and certainly what's happening within the workplace. A steady increase in the difficulty in getting people to A, cough up, B, recognize the situation they're in, and also a rise in the number of people who are defining or being defined as vulnerable. Now, this is an interesting question, and one that comes up on just about every course that we do currently, because I always like to ask the question, what exactly do we mean by vulnerable? And if you have a look at the screen that I've got up in front of us now, we can see that we've got different types of sections on different types of vulnerability: the potentially vulnerable, the vulnerable, and the particularly vulnerable. Now, I wonder whether that rings a bell with any of you in terms of the different types of people that you're speaking to. But in most cases, the hardest group to deal with is the one at the bottom there, the particularly vulnerable. And the scale is one that needs to be taken seriously, because if people are vulnerable, it could be for a number of reasons, which we'll come to. But this idea of vulnerability of the individual is something that has had a profound effect on our society over the last few years. And I'm really unsure to a great degree where it came from, this idea that people are vulnerable, other than to say that it seems to be something that comes with making what we do and who we are a therapeutic endeavor. And by that I mean that we are all in some way unwell, that we are all in some way not all we could be, and that the therapeutic is that which will fix it. So this idea of people who are vulnerable is a very interesting one, and problematic from the point of view of staff who are debt collecting for an organization or are dealing with people in the general public, when that potentially vulnerable falls between two camps, which is somebody who is obviously very ill, or is obviously in deep trouble, or is unable to help themselves in any way, versus at the other end of the scale, somebody who's put in the lead. And by that I mean is not vulnerable at all, but it's become a buzzword that can be used. This happens particularly in the arena of mental health. A good example of that is recent work that we did with one of the organizations, where the idea of my mental health isn't well enough for me to be able to deal with this has now become one of the common refrains that we hear. And I don't know whether that's a refrain that you will have heard, but that's certainly one that's come up in various sessions that I've been running over the past 2 years. This has become problematic in other arenas. It's not just this arena, but the idea of the individual as being somebody who is unwell or is weak and not able to cope. And often we take that as read because it seems not nice to do so. You don't want to be the one that says, I'm not sure about this, it doesn't feel right. You don't want to be the one that is saying, I don't think we should take it as read that somebody's vulnerable, that they're unwell. So it could occur, as it says here, suddenly or gradually, and it may be temporary, permanent, or fluctuating. Well, that's a terribly, terribly ephemeral and difficult notion to pin down, because then it means that individual can use the idea of vulnerability or illness, particularly mental health, as a reason not to take responsibility for their lives. Now, that's the one end of the scale. The other end of the scale is where somebody is genuinely in trouble and will need signposting elsewhere, or is genuinely in trouble because they are unwell, or because they are suicidal, and we've had to deal with those as well. So that's a different end of the scale altogether. So let's take a look at the next slide. And let's have a look and see the scale of vulnerability as defined here from the research. 1 in 7 adults have literacy skills that are respective of a child aged 11 or below. That's extraordinary. At a time when our world is becoming a much more cognitive world, where we're actually having to use our thought processes far more, and it's more complicated than it's ever been, we're saying that 1 in 7 adults have literacy skills expected of a child aged 11 or below. And the same there goes with numeracy attainment. So from that perspective alone, we've got a problematic thing going on. We then have the dementia, over 800,000 people now live with varying degrees of dementia, and that's expected to double in the next 40 years. So you're dealing with somebody who looks after the individual, perhaps, which you've had come up. And then you've got people who don't have any savings to cover an unexpected bill. And then you have those that have caring responsibilities, disability, mental illness, and I'm using the word illness there particularly. In a given year, 1 in 4 adults experience at least one mental disorder. Let's not confuse a mental disorder with a mental illness. To be diagnosed with a mental illness is one thing, to have a mental health issue is another. And then, of course, old age, which we are rapidly approaching, some of us. Over 1.4 million people in the UK are aged over 85, and this is predicted to double over the next 20 years, including me, sadly. So the scale of vulnerability is something that we can't ignore. However, what we have to ask ourselves as individuals that are caught between the devil and the deep blue sea is, at what point does our responsibility to the individual end? And does our responsibility to the organization begin? And when you look at what happened with the poll we took earlier on, it's fairly obvious that that is the thing that seems to be the most important, is how do you walk that fine line between they're not well enough for us to be able to do anything, or they're going to need help, we need to signpost them somewhere else, or this person's swinging the lead. Because we all know, the work we've done in the DWP certainly tells us this, that the biggest offenders when it comes to benefit fraud and theft are the elderly. They, by a long chalk, they are the worst. And often it is people who have said that they've not got XYZ when they've got a business they're running, or they've got 2 houses in somebody else's name, or whatever it may be. So we're after looking at how can we get your people to get that one deal, or that one piece of work finished, that means the council gets more money in than they normally would. That's what you're looking to do, because we are never going to get them all. And in order to do that, we've got to take account of common factors such as these. 50 most common risk factors you can see there. I'm not going to read them all out. Some of them are more serious than others. Some of them are the sort of thing that we come across every day. But it's interesting there, you see that mental illness is number 1 there. And on the right-hand side, you can see some statistics in there around increase in suicide rates, although the highness of that figure is largely due to young people, sadly. And they, as you can see at the bottom, 3/4 of all suicides in the UK were men. So you've got this problem with also people who are suicidal or who are generally unwell, which is a separate issue from how do we get our individuals to bring in more cash to the company, or to the organization in your case, or to the council, or whatever it is that you're running. How do we get people to be able to do that from those that can genuinely afford to? It's how do you sort the wheat from the chaff? And this comes down to, there's no getting away from it, no matter which way you look at it, it comes down to, and always does, communication, and our ability to communicate with individuals, and our ability to do that well. So what we've looked at in the past, and what's proved particularly useful, is the concept of communicating to achieve an end, which is about persuasiveness. It's about taking control of the call. It's about understanding an individual. It's about the use of empathy, as well as the use of your communication skills to ensure somebody agrees to a given path. And then, of course, your ability to discriminate based on, can they actually achieve the path that you've given them? There's no point in lumbering somebody with a payment that they're not going to be able to afford, because you'll just simply get them back on the phone a few weeks later. So this is an incredibly complex field. People like to say that it's easy. It's not. It simply isn't. So when it comes to dealing with vulnerable, distressed, and people who are suicidal, that's really something that is a separate issue from how do we also identify the ones who aren't paying for other reasons and who actually should be. So you've got a twofold thing going on there at the very least. But you can see that 41% of organizations did not ask how the mental health was affecting somebody's financial situation. They weren't interested in knowing about that. 35% felt that despite telling the organization about their mental health, the problem was not taken into account. So it's how do you deal with this? And I think this is an interesting question of our times. When I consider when I was younger, and I hate to do the reminiscing thing, but I'm going to do it, is that it would have never occurred to my grandmother, who was born in 1889, to be in debt. It would have horrified her. I watched a wonderful film the other day called Ladies Who Do, which is from the 1960s. It's about a group of women who use waste paper bins that they get from their companies to bet on the stock market with the information it gives them. And they can't believe they're making this much money, and they feel it's dishonest. And this idea of not being in debt seems to have something that's been lost in the midst of time, and that now being in debt is not seen as problematic, and it's as if something you can simply do and you don't have to pay for it. Well, there's an awful lot of that going on as well, so you've got to be very careful about how you manage those two separate situations. And then we ask ourselves the questions like you can see on the right there on the presentation. Do you have a culture that encourages staff to understand and empathize with vulnerability? Well, we want the answer to that to be yes, but we also want the staff to be trained to resolve conflict, and also to be able to understand the individuals and recognize where they can and where they cannot attain a good outcome for the council or for the housing association. Getting personally involved. This is a difficult one. We've spoken to people in the various councils that I've worked in, the various housing associations, and you tend to get two type of people who come to the fore. The ones who say to me, well, I'm on the phone, I don't care, they're going to pay. And the other ones who say, I find it so hard because I feel so sorry for them. Well, there's a line somewhere in the center. There's a piece there at the center that comes from understanding the best ways to possibly do this. And it's to look at some of the responses that you get, whether it's an apathetic response where you walk on by, it's a sympathetic response where you jump in with them, or an empathetic response where you rescue safely while protecting self. The idea of the person being in the water and you throw in the water ring to help them survive. An empathetic response, you walk on by. The sympathetic response, you just jump in the water with them. And the empathetic response being the one that would use the life ring. Well, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, because the point being is that when somebody owes you money, it's not like they're drowning. So there is a need for empathy, but not too much empathy. You can over empathize. So we've talked very much in depth around levels of listening and what it means to be an empathic listener, and why you shouldn't be an empathic listener. Empathic listeners are generally seen as people who are counselors or people who deal with people who are in very serious issues in their lives. So being an empathic listener is not necessarily a good idea when you are trying to negotiate a debt with someone. So communicating with targets in mind. This is the bit. It's all very well and good. Mrs. Smith can't pay. Mr. Smith's having problems. Understanding that and being able to say, we'll help you, and we can forward you to where you need to go. It still doesn't help us with the fact that you're communicating with targets in mind, that you might well have a debt repayment plan needed to bring targets to a certain fruition, that there'll be financial assessment decisions made by staff in your organization, and that the way people communicate, which is to communicate to a solution, is often what is not happening. We see an awful lot of talking around the subject rather than about the subject. And we also see a lot of what I would call a didactic approach to it, where people are being told that they must pay. Whereas we need to look at a situation whereby they're encouraged to understand why they should pay. So delivering skills and changing behaviors on this. I'm going to come to the end of this now because I want to get to the Q&A. Really what we're talking about here is having people understand that although they are dealing with human beings and sometimes empathy of the highest order is needed, that they are, in the end of the day, that they are there to collect debt. And like any product, because debt is a product, that has to be sold. So we've got to bring together a group of skills that are often disparate in order for individuals to be able to survive and work well within your organizations. Looking at listening skills, communication skills, what do we understand about why we're where we are? Why do people think it's okay to be in debt? Why is debt so much of a more problem now than it was 15 years ago? And why have you seen the increase, a steady increase in this that you've seen? These are interesting questions that we will attempt to answer with you. And I think it's important that you get the chance to ask specific questions around this. So I want to move on to the Q&A, and I think you can type. There's a little box that you can type into there that you can type and ask me some questions. So I'd be happy if somebody wants to come up with some questions and ask me some questions and help move us forward. And then I can be very specific about some of the things that you're looking to achieve. Who'd like to go first? Fire away. Are you there, Paul?
Hi Barry, yeah, just to come in on just to come in on some of the work we've done recently. One of the things that we struggled with to get the positive outcome was the whole empathy bit. How do we move staff from empathy to get the positive responses we need, and the outcome being a good recovery rate?
Well, we've in particular, I mean, this is probably the single biggest question that comes up, and half the problem that we've got is that people often don't see that it is their role to persuade. That's the biggest issue we've got, and it takes time for them to understand how that persuasiveness works. So we go through a number of theories, including transactional analysis and Cartman dramas and other things that come into the program that also mean then they can understand more about actually their job is one to persuade. It is one to persuade, and it's to persuade the person that it's in their best interests for them to start paying off the debt that they owe, whether it be a big debt or whether it be a small debt. That's the point it gets to. So it's about how, if you want to get those positive outcomes, then you've really got to work on not so much empathy, which I understand why you'd want to, because you want to be able to show that you appreciate where an individual is, but I would say more on being able to illustrate the entire picture to the individual so that they understand what the real consequences are going to be of non-payment. So it's about that. It's about recognizing that we can be positive about things, but that ain't going to get you your money. You know, being real is more likely to get you money. Somebody once said to me, which do you prefer? Would you rather have 10 people that are positive or 10 people that are negative? And I said, well, if the negative people can do the job better, I'd rather have the negative ones. So there's a question about being real rather than either of those two things, which is we have to be real about the situations that these people are in, and we have to be real with them about the consequences and the outcome of what's going to happen if they don't play ball. Now, that's going to happen if somebody is, whether they're vulnerable or not. Just because somebody has a mental health issue doesn't mean they can't work. It doesn't mean they can't take control of their lives. I know many people who are unwell mentally but still have absolutely productive lives. So we've got not to get caught in that empathy trap, but to be able to open it out wider and say that empathy is only one of the tools that we use in the toolkit for debt collection for councils and for housing associations. Does that answer that question for you, Paul?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's as an ex-local authority manager with a debt recovery hat on, the feedback I used to always get was, well, we're quite worried about that individual. How can we force a recovery when that person is coming across as not well, or is vulnerable? So yeah, I think we've got to show empathy, but at the same time take some action.
I agree. I mean, the other thing, of course, is to bear in mind that although, yes, we will get people who are suicidal, I've had them in the past myself, and I'm sure you have, that you are not a counsellor, right? You are certainly in no position to be trained to deal with somebody who's in that situation. So it's important that organisations have a suicide policy. They have a policy. For example, at the DWP, when I was doing the work there, a suicide call would mean that we had a yellow card that we held up, for example. And then we'd say, and then you would say to the person, I'm sorry, but you need to repeat what you just said to me to find out whether or not they were serious. And quite often, once you've done that, they would come back with, no, it's okay. I'm just upset. It's not your fault. Right. And on other occasions, they go, I am serious. And the phone would go down and there'd be silence. And of course, then you're straight on to the police. So it's about being able to separate out those which you can do nothing about, and also be able to handle the fact they're going to happen as an individual from your own emotional well-being point of view, from where somebody is saying, well, I'm not going to pay you, I'm going to come and kill myself, and they're only actually doing it for the fun of it, which some people do. It's a terrible thing, but they will do it. Unfortunately, I think that's very sad that happens. So I would agree with you on that front. There's another question come up here. Why do we think we've got more vulnerable people now than we didn't have before? Well, I think we like vulnerability in this country. I think we like people to be victims. I think that's what it is. I think we've made being a victim of something, whatever it may be, attractive. And I think that's half the trouble, is that people would rather embrace the need of or the feel of being a victim than deal with whatever's going on in their life. And so it's very hard for us to be able to go to them and say, right, this is what's going to happen if you don't pay, because they'll cry victim. You're bullying me. I'm a victim. When in fact, they're only a victim of their own inability to pay the debt that's due. So in that point, then you've got to be looking at extremely good persuasion skills to be able to get past that, I would say, to answer that question. Would you like to add anything else on that, Paul?
The other part of the challenge would be is always the initial conflict that you get when you're dealing with debt recovery. How do you deal with the conflict part of the conversation?
It's this again. This is one that comes to the fore all the time. And when we talk, for example, quite often because as you know, we're very flexible about how we teach on the day, because often you're having to deal with the organizational musts and the ideas and objectives that are brought by the trainees, is that we always talk about this from the perspective of not having what's called a Cartman drama. And a Cartman drama is anything in which there is a victim, a perpetrator, and usually somebody who's winding the individual up to be like it. So you can very quickly, if you're not careful, place yourself in that perpetrator role, in which means that you then have them screaming more about being a victim or being angry or being upset. And if there's somebody that's that upset, that they're that angry, they're just screaming, you have to let them get on with it. Because the minute you interrupt them, they'll start screaming again. You've got to let them get on with it. And then, as always I'm told, they will inevitably then go, "Are you still there?" Which is the response they always give once you've gone quiet. Yes, I'm still here. I'm just listening. So you've got to let them get rid of that steam that's going on. And then you've got to be able to make statements about the now. Right, so you've got to be able to say, well, you and I have got this particular situation going on here, and we need to look at what it is you're going to do to put the situation right. So how about we put our heads together and see what we can come up with? So you make it collaborative. That's the whole secret of what we do when we get people to use the skills we espouse, is about getting them to be collaborative with the individual on the phone, so that you're not setting up a victim persecutor narrative. You're setting up a coach creator narrative, which is a narrative in which the individual can then come up with a solution to the problem in which they find themselves. Does that adequately illustrate it for you, Paul?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Is anybody else going to come up with a question for me? Anything at all is fine. What we got here then? Okay, how do you deal with violent people? A lot of what I've done in the past few months have been with people who also deal with the public face-to-face, and that I think is a bigger issue. So you've got the face-to-face side and you've got the phone side. When it comes to the phone side, what it means with violent people, I would say there's only so much you have to put up with. We've had them say, I know where you live, I'm going to come and get you and your kids and your dog, and it's got incredibly nasty. There's only so much you have to take until you red flag the person as dangerous. But I think it's easier to deal with it on the phone, because often it's just anger and it will dissipate unless it gets particularly virulent and particularly personal, in which case then you have to obviously raise that further up the ladder. When it comes to face-to-face, I found actually that the people that I've been working with who are working face-to-face have often worked in difficult face-to-face situations. So last week when I was teaching, we had two bouncers, ex-bouncers, who were working within the organisation, the housing association, and they knew more about how to calm somebody down or recognise when somebody was going to get violent than we did. So they were able to talk very, very deeply about that. And there are steps you can go through to avoid an escalation of that kind of violence that you can see from the public. So we cover that. We look at what's happening here, how do you not exacerbate it, how do you calm the person down? And again, you're back to the same thing as we said earlier on, which is persuasion and communication. So either way, that's what you're left with, is this idea of having to persuade and communicate in a way that the individual is going to listen to. And that doesn't mean shouting over them. That means giving them the space to breathe and then coming back. I mean, those absolutely inevitable words, "I know it's not you," which they always use when they've given you a complete ear bashing because you've asked them for some money. So that's there's one for the violent thing. Anything else, Paul? Do you want to bring anything else up? Carl, are you still there? Anything else you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, a question's just come up actually, Barry, about protecting the welfare of your team and staff members who may also be vulnerable. But also, obviously, if they're receiving calls every day from vulnerable and distressed clients, it's going to take its toll on staff. So how do you protect them? Is the question.
Well, that's a really interesting one, because you have, believe it or not, it's exactly the same principles. I think the point being is that you've got to recognise that if you're in the type of role that requires you to collect debt, that this is a job that is not easy. Not everybody can do it. There are worse jobs. At the DWP where I was working recently, we worked in a department where all they dealt with calls about people dying all day. Now that's incredibly hard, because no call is an upbeat call. They're all downbeat calls. Well, when it comes to this, doing the debt collection side of things, you've got to look after yourself, and the best way to be able to look after yourself is to try to maintain that peace at the center, which is not to get too involved and not to care too little. I think that's the biggest problem. So when we do transaction analysis within the training, and we talk about the different ego states that individuals can be in, and we talk about how you manage your mood and you manage your temperament, that's very much about how an individual keeps themselves from getting too affected by the role. The one thing I've noticed, Carl, which is quite interesting, is the longevity of some of the people doing these roles. They've been there an awful long time. A lot of them know an awful lot already, and it's just a matter of refreshing. And what we tend to get is they like the fact that we can bring them some new ways of looking at an old situation. So it's not generally newer people we're dealing with, it's generally people who've been there much longer. So it's interesting when we get that, which is sort of people who've been there 25 years going, well, I've never looked at it from that way before. That's a good way to look at it. So we're looking at the steps of persuasion. How do you persuade somebody to round to your way of thinking? They've never thought about it that way before, particularly the idea of debt as a product, that you're selling the idea of getting out of debt. Well, you are, you're selling it. Doesn't matter which way you cut it. It is selling. And it's a matter of being persuasive and getting the individual to do it. Now, if you're effective at that and you're good at that, no matter what the fact is that you're asking them for money because they're in debt, if you achieve, you'll still feel good about it. I know it sounds strange, but it's true. I've got a friend of mine who works for the co-op in the funeral department, and every month they have a PowerPoint, and last month the PowerPoint came up and said that they were unhappy because not enough people were dying. Well, you know, it's extraordinary how we can get involved in things in work, and the same principles at work here, which is if you achieve well at what you're doing and hit your targets and help people where necessary and forward people to the right areas if they need it, then you'll feel good about it. And if you feel good about it, your mental well-being is going to be better. It's that simple. Being skilled up, being knowledgeable, knowing what you're doing goes a long way to ensuring that your staff's well-being stays that way. Well, is that okay, Carl? Has he gone? Are you there, Carl? Is anybody there?
I'm still here, Barry. I've got possibly one final question.
Go on then.
Obviously, our courses, how do managers evaluate the success of a course where debt recovery is involved, particularly around local authorities and housing associations? How do we follow up and make sure that course has had some value?
Well, the value comes from your people. I mean, what you want is narratives. I mean, we all do the evaluation sheets at the end. Most people know that learning and development specialists have done those for years, but that's not really where the proof of the pudding is. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If you're an individual who's a manager within a given role within a housing association or a council, then you'll see it. If the course has been effective, you'll see it. If what's been said has been effective, you'll see it. And you should begin to see it manifest itself in an increased debt recovery. Now, that's not to say it's an easy journey. It's not. You might learn 4 new theories on a given day with a Scala, and you'll take away 2 of those, which you'll work on for the next 6 weeks in order to achieve. So you would expect to see a slow, gradual growth while people put on the new suit, so to speak, a new way of doing things, and head into it. I did some stuff a few months back, not with a Scala, where they expected an immediate change and it didn't happen. And they were concerned that there wasn't an immediate change. Well, it's because people are trying to get their head around the new stuff. People just don't go, I'm going to do this differently now. You can't just do that overnight. Whereas I've been doing it this long, now I'm going to do it this way. So there is a gradual sort of embedding of the skills into the workforce. And from a team perspective, I'd ask the team manager. Then the manager can talk to the team manager. But you would see hopefully an increase in certainly the motivation and the ability perhaps or the want to try something new. One of the biggest enemies we have in terms of debt collection, particularly in councils and in housing associations, is our inability to change, is for people to be able to go, I'll do something different, because the cry is often, we've always done it this way. Well, sometimes you have to do things differently. Things have changed. People are not the same about debt now that they were 10 years ago. I genuinely believe that. I genuinely do. And I think that means we have to change what we do. We have to change the behavior we use. And the course is designed to do that. The courses are designed to get people to think, hang on a minute, if I try X, Y might happen. And if Y happens, I'm more successful. And that's what we're after. That's what we're after. Because in some cases, you could be getting £500 a month, £1,000 a month out of people. Or it could be £5 a week or £10 a week. It could be anything. But the more success that's enjoyed by the council, the more success that's enjoyed in recovering debt, the more the council has money to spend on other things. And that's got to be worth having a go at. And I think to see that happen, you need to be looking for where have people changed behavior. From our perspective, the ideal situation is follow-up workshops, which is where 6 weeks down the line, you have a workshop with each of the attending groups. And then 12 weeks down the line, you have a workshop with each of the attending groups, which is where you can hone some of the skills. What's working, what's not? What do we need to add? What can we also include? So there's all that goes on as well. We actually can do that as well, which helps people to embed the learning into what they're doing. This is not a simple trip. It's not a simple journey. And doing this type of thing never is. But delivering skills of this sort means that we can challenge the individual to do better. And to monitor that, you just keep in touch with the individual. You've got to look for narratives. Where are the stories coming from? Are the cold figures telling us that we're doing better? And if so, how are we doing that? And how have we allowed that to happen? And what was the situation in which that happened? So we need to examine how the learning embedded so that it can then be repeated. That's the secret.
Thanks, Barry.
Okay, have we got any more
thanks, Barry.
questions? Oh, you're back, Carl. Hello. Any
Yeah,
more?
sorry about that. I lost you before. Yeah, a few more questions have come through. So, a message from Alison. Any suggestions on how to cut through the vulnerable perception?
And did you say Alison?
Yes.
Hello, Alison. I think it's a shame they can't give you a thumbs up on the chat, isn't it? Hello, Alison. To cut through the vulnerability.
Perception, yes.
Yeah, yes. Do you mean the perception in staff? Now, I'm going to assume that you mean the perception in staff, because the employee will get on the phone and the person will give them a story. It may be true, may not be true, maybe half true, maybe all lies. You don't know, and that person will be then subject to, oh gosh, I can't possibly listen to their story. Well, the story needs to be tested. We don't believe everybody off the bat. So if we're going to get through that kind of vulnerability, if we're going to get through the idea or the perception that the person is vulnerable, you've got to ask questions that are very real. You've got to ask questions that are centered in the now, that appeal to the individual. And send. So, for example, somebody gets on the phone and you say, "Guys, Mr. Smith, I'm calling from Escala Debt Collection." Oh, and then the stories come, and then you listen and say, you might respond with, "How you doing? It must be very hard." And they'll come back with, "Yes, it is." In which case, you might then go ahead with, "Let's you and I put our heads together. How about let's try and approach a way that we can deal with this, because I don't believe for 1 second that you like being in debt." Now, that's a very real question. Yep. Or you could say, "This is obviously bothering you. Let's put our heads together and see how we can come to a solution." And it's the type of language you use. Let's you and I work on a solution. How about that? This isn't going to go away, Mrs. Jones. So I suggest you and I put our heads together now and see what we can come up with. How does that sound? And when they get even more difficult, when it comes, I can't possibly, then you might do it in terms of talking about what happens if they don't. Can I just take you through, if I can, Mr. Smith? I know this isn't very nice, but I need to take you through what's going to happen if this debt isn't paid. And then you might list 2 or 3 things that are going to happen and then respond with, "Wouldn't it be better if you and I tried to come up with a solution now?" How does that sound, Carl? I know you can't speak to Alison, but how does that sound, Carl, to you?
Yeah, so I've just got a little bit more information. So it just says the perception by senior managers and politicians is what's come back.
What, the perception by senior managers and politicians that people are vulnerable?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's a very interesting. Goodness me, that's a bit highbrow for a Tuesday afternoon, but we'll give it a go anyway, Alison. I would challenge the question. I wouldn't accept the premise of the question. I genuinely wouldn't. But I don't know what your position is, Alison. From my position, when I go to meetings with politicians in my local area, then I'm able to say what I want. You may not be able to do that, but my situation would be that they're making statements that include the words vulnerable. I want you to ask the question, well, how do we know these people are vulnerable? How do we know? And at what point do you not class these people as vulnerable? You've got to start asking questions about the detail, Alison, because the devil's in the detail. Ask questions about the detail. So exactly what defines somebody as vulnerable? That's the question you should ask. Not everybody that's vulnerable can't pay their bills. That's a statement to make. So what you're talking about really is trying to punch a hole in a narrative or a notion, an idea that seems absolutely insurmountable. Well, ask questions that are incredibly detailed. That's what I would recommend doing. Can you just define for me, please, what exactly makes somebody vulnerable? And how do I differentiate that from somebody who isn't? Or you might even want to say, putting vulnerable people aside for the moment, what about ones that aren't? How do you want us to deal with them? Or you can do it the inverse way. Putting aside those we can deal with, what about the ones it's harder to deal with? What do you want us to do with them? So I would say you've got to ask a lot of questions, but they must be at a very, very low level, but high resolution, tactical level, not a strategic level. So you're asking questions about the nitty gritty, and that way you can start to get them to explain the narrative or to alter the narrative in a great way. But good luck to you, because it's hard to do, very hard to do. Any more from Alison, Carl, or is that it?
No, we got one from Mohammed. Do you have any examples of techniques of persuasion and how you can persuade people? Any tips, techniques?
Yeah, certainly. I would suggest that something that I've used for a very long time is the Cialdini's 7 steps of persuasion. I would suggest you go to the interweb and log into the YouTubes, and you can then watch something called the science of persuasion, which is a whiteboard presentation. Mohammed, if you watch that, you can adapt it to just about everything you want to do. That's what I'd recommend. That would be the best one for you, I would imagine. Okay, Carl?
I think that's it for questions, unless anybody else has got any questions.
Now's your chance, folks. Come on, type away. Is anybody typing? Paul, anything else you'd like to add or ask about?
I think I'm okay, and thanks, Barry.
Aren't we doing another one? There's going to be another one on equality and diversity and inclusion, isn't there? I think.
Yes.
So that's going to be coming up shortly, so that might be quite interesting. If you've got any more questions, you can get hold of me via Paul or via Carl, and then they'll send the questions to me, and I'll attempt to answer them for you. Other than that, thanks very much for spending time with us and for asking questions, and I hope it goes well, and hopefully I'll meet some of you in the future.
Okay, and that's it, folks. So as I said before, we'll send out the recording of the webinar via email to you and the slide deck. And that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar today. So thanks again, thanks for your time, and goodbye, everybody.